The clown show of the government's border and isolation policy rumbles on. It is becoming apparent that Arthur has no idea what Martha is about. Instead of competence, we've got incompetence, coupled with gross negligence. Michael Morrah has been, until recently, the sole media voice questioning the competence of ministers, and for his efforts, the Jacinda-maniacs have been abusing him for daring to point out that the princess's halo has slipped. But things are changing, because Andrea Vance, normally a pom-pom waving cheerleader for the government, got stuck in yesterday over the big little lies the government has been peddling. And it is a long, long list of lies. The gloss has come off the government. They wanted a COVID election, well now they've got one. We have a government that seems to have gotten through the first lockdown through good luck rather than good management. When you think about it for just a minute, it really shouldn't be a surprise that the whole thing has turned out to be an omni-shambles. After all, this is the same government who did nothing for a year except employ high-priced consultants and working groups, declared the following year to be the year of delivery and then delivered nothing, have failed spectacularly on key election planks like Kiwi Build and light rail to Auckland Airport. It really was stretching credulity to think that they had done a brilliant job at the border. Turns out they haven't. I'm Cam Slater, and this is Insight Politics. Jacinda Ardern asked us to know her government by their deeds. I've made this a recurring theme. What is also recurring is utter incompetence from her and her ministers. Sure, she gets a gold star for hugs and feels, but on everything else, she'd get a not achieved grade in NCEA. The latest debacles are really hitting home just how incompetent they really are. Last week we found out that from 3 eminent High Court judges that the first lockdown was unlawful. The judges saw fit to say that breaking the law was justifiable. I wonder if they'd accept that excuse in their normal day-to-day dispensing of justice. I'd pick that wouldn't be a starter. It simply is not acceptable for the government to act unlawfully. But strangely, the usual civil liberties wonks and rent-a-mob crazies who would protest at almost anything have remained silent. It seems if a left-wing government breaks the law, they're fine with that, but the howls of outrage from centre-right governments breaking the law are deafening in the extreme. It also seems that they don't mind the knee of the state pressing down on their necks if the jackboot attached to the leg that is suffocating them has a red sole on it. The government were caught out when Barry Soper and I exposed the Crown Law had advised the police that the lockdown was illegal and also unenforceable. The police were itching to use their flash new jackboots, but wisely sought legal advice. The Attorney-General, David Parker, promptly declared the advice was a draft and also said there were no gaps in the law. Clearly he was wrong and has been shown how inept he was by 3 High Court judges. The fact that he has refused to release the advice shows he has something to hide, which is ironic because that's the only thing the most transparent government ever does really well, covering things up. Then we have the ongoing festering sore of border and quarantine control. On Saturday, we learnt that nurses have been moonlighting at quarantine facilities and also working on wards at the hospitals. It is now thought that one of those in quarantine was infected in a lift by a nurse. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out the problem that having nurses working in quarantine facilities and in their day job at the hospital presents. But where did the government think it was going to magic up nurses from? The nurse fairy? Which highlights the problem you get when command and control socialists get to play with levers, switches and buttons. Somehow they think that if they say something, that the minions will tug their forelocks, don overalls and whistle a happy tune at the coalface and do what they've been ordered to do. Which is precisely what happened last week when it was revealed that the Ministry of Health hadn't implemented the government's testing strategy at the border. Chris Hipkins is becoming the comical Ali of New Zealand politics when he insisted that he ordered the testing regime put in place, but the health boffins had ignored those orders, only to end up red-faced after admitting he actually hadn't read the Ministry of Health's testing strategy document. If events were so serious, they'd be hilarious, as Dr. Ashley Bloomfield said that there had been a dissonance in communication. It's something like out of Yes Minister. There was comical Chris asking health boffins if the testing strategy had been implemented, and them saying in return that, Yes Minister, a testing strategy had been implemented. What was unsaid was that it wasn't the minister's strategy, mainly because the Ministry of Health didn't agree to test everyone. No, these experts only agreed that symptomatic people should be tested. Given 80% of people infected with the Chinese plague are asymptomatic, you can see the flaw in their plan. With moonlighting nurses, failure to regularly test all the border workers and interns, regularly absconding from isolation, it cannot have been a surprise that we had another outbreak. Despite all the glaring failures, it seems that no one is actually going to be held responsible, other than the poor sods currently under lockdown in Auckland watching their jobs and businesses disappear as a result of government incompetence. So the Prime Minister says, know us by our deeds, which is hard because quite literally they haven't done anything, and the things they did do have been abject failures. They don't know how to build houses, they don't know how to end child poverty, they don't know how to build public transport, they didn't deliver anything in the year of delivery, they couldn't distribute PPE in a timely fashion, they couldn't get the flu vaccine out to doctors, they don't know how to control the border, they don't know how to test, and they didn't know the lockdown was unlawful. And they don't know how to stop lying about all their failures. If we're to know them by their deeds, then those deeds are incompetent. And can we start referring to the government's alleged success as dumb luck? Surely it isn't anything less than this point, being that they're dumb and lucky. And while we're talking about knowing them by their deeds and lying, we can know that we were being lied to about the official statistics. How so? Well, the Ministry of Health released an Official Information Act request about the so-called 22 deaths from the Chinese plague. And it turns out, from the breakdown of the 22 deaths from the plague, that 5 of the 22 did not die from the Chinese plague. 4 of the 5 tested negative. Yep, negative. And 1 wasn't tested at all. If they can't tell the truth about basic statistics, what can they tell the truth about?
Faces filled with joy and cheer, what a magical time of year. Howdy ho, it's Weasel Stomping Day. Put your Viking helmet on, spread that mayonnaise on the lawn. Don't you know it's Weasel Stomping Day? All the little girls and boys love that wonderful crunching noise.
You'll know what this day's about
when you stomp a weasel's guts right out. So come along and have a laugh. Snap their weaselly spines in half. Grab your boots and stomp your cares away. Hip hip hooray, it's Weasel Stomping Day.
In echoes of George Orwell's Animal Farm, this week's political weasel has lectured farmers about following the law. No one is above the law, said Attorney General David Parker, without so much as a blush about his own role in the government breaking the law with the first lockdown. Orwell's refrain, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, has never been more relevant. For Southland farmers to cop a warning from David Parker for taking part in a boycott of the government's essential freshwater legislation is rank hypocrisy. On Wednesday, Southland Federated Farmers President Jeffrey Young had called on farmers not to apply for winter grazing resource consents next season as a boycott against some new rules he called unworkable. But Parker said it was irresponsible of Young to call on Southern farmers to breach the new freshwater regulations relating to winter grazing. No one is above the law. Quite. So when is this weasel going to take some responsibility for his own law breaking? Or is it really a case of some animals being more equal than others? David Parker joins the axis of weasel along with Chris Hipkins. Your Romacraft Weaselito is waiting here for you. Sky News host Rowan Dean says the effectiveness of COVID-19 herd immunity strategy implemented in Sweden and Switzerland should put the fear of God into every politician in this country.
2 words that should put the fear of God into every politician in this country, every highly paid bureaucrat, every chief medical officer, every health administrator, and every unemployed man and woman now looking at lives shattered, careers devastated, dreams obliterated, and futures destroyed. 2 words that are also 2 European countries, Sweden and Switzerland. Let's start with Sweden. 4 months ago, we interviewed on Outsiders Professor Johan Giesecke, the former state epidemiologist for Sweden and the mentor to Anders Tegnell, who has been in charge of Sweden's controversial response to COVID-19. On that show, which any politician in Australia could have chosen to watch, Professor Johan Giesecke spelt out in crystal clear detail that you could not eradicate the coronavirus, you could only slow it down, and that the only people that should be quarantined were the elderly and the vulnerable as a preventative measure. A major lockdown, he warned, such as they did in the UK and we are now seeing in Victoria and New Zealand, he warned would simply leave the population without herd immunity, so permanently vulnerable, and in the process completely destroy our economies. Let me now quote from Friday's editorial in the UK Telegraph, not some crazy conspiracy rag, but one of Britain's most respected newspapers. Here's what they said. So now we know Sweden got it largely right and the British establishment catastrophically wrong. Anders Tegnell, Stockholm's epidemiologist king, has pulled off a remarkable triple whammy. Far fewer deaths per capita than Britain, a maintenance of basic freedoms and opportunities, and most strikingly, a recession less than half as severe as our own. Our arrogant quangocrats, says the UK Telegraph editorial, and state experts should hang their heads in shame. Their reaction to coronavirus was one of the greatest public policy blunders in modern history. Millions will lose their jobs, tens of thousands of small businesses are failing, vast numbers are likely to die from untreated or undetected illnesses. Sound familiar? Daniel, Jacinda, Anastasia? Also this week, Dr. Sebastian Rushgrove, a Swedish doctor writing on the Spectator Coffeehouse blog, confirms firsthand the success of the Swedish approach. He writes, all the COVID patients have disappeared. It is now 4 months since the start of the pandemic, and I haven't seen a single COVID patient in over a month, says the Swedish Dr. Rushgrove. At the peak, 3 months back, 100 people were dying a day of COVID in Sweden, a country with a population of 10 million. We are now down to around 5 people dying per day in the whole country, and that number continues to drop. The daily risk per person of getting infected is 1 in 10,000, which is minuscule. Basically, COVID is in all practical senses over and done with in Sweden. After 4 months, Sweden ripped the metaphorical Band-Aid off quickly, he writes, and got the epidemic over and done with in a short amount of time, while the rest of the world has chosen to try to peel the Band-Aid off slowly. COVID is over in Sweden, he writes. People have gone back to their normal lives and barely anyone is getting infected anymore. I am willing to bet, he says, that the countries that have shut down completely will see rates spike when they open up. If that is the case, then there won't have been any point in shutting down in the first place. That's Sweden. It appears that the warnings we made on this program before anyone else in Australia may well have been accurate.
Detractors point to the death rate in Sweden without drilling down into the underlying details, such as the average age of those dying. As Rowan Dean noted and Alistair Heath wrote at the Telegraph, Anders Tegnell, Stockholm's epidemiologist king, has pulled off a remarkable triple whammy. Far fewer deaths per capita than Britain, a maintenance of basic freedoms and opportunities including schooling, and most strikingly, a recession less than half as severe as our own. He is, of course, talking about the UK and the town-by-town lockdowns the UK is currently experiencing, along with the catastrophic impact on the economy as a result. More and more evidence is mounting that lockdowns don't work, mainly because at some point you must lift it and the virus is free to roam again. A survey by the Auckland Chamber of Commerce suggests that up to a quarter of businesses will fold if lockdowns continue.
So the first question that we put to you was, how many lockdowns do you think you could do and still survive? And I have to say, 18% of those that responded said 0. That's it. This is too hard. And then if you take those that said that maybe one more, that was 28%. So 28%. So you've now got 46, so just under 50% of those that responded. And I think it's a good reflection of the Auckland business community. Just under 50% is saying, maybe one more, but after that, we're gone. A further 24% said that they could do a couple, but it just shows you how fragile our business communities are.
And 89% of workers in Auckland are reported to be on the wage subsidy. And the economic comparison between Sweden and the UK is stark. Again, from the Telegraph, almost all economists thought that Sweden's economy would suffer hugely from its idiosyncratic strategy. They were wrong. Sweden's GDP fell by just 8.6% in the first half of the year, all in the second quarter, and its excess debts jumped 24%. A big part of Sweden's recession was caused by a slump in demand for its exports from its fully locked down neighbours. One could speculate that had all countries pursued a Swedish-style strategy, the economic hit could have been worth no more than 3 to 4% of GDP. That could be seen as the core cost of the virus under a sensible policy reaction. By contrast, Britain's economy slumped 22.2% in the first half of the year, a performance almost 3 times as bad as Sweden's, and its excess deaths shot up by 45%. Spain's national income slumped by even more, 22.7%, and France's, down 18.9%, and Italy's, down 17.1%, slightly less. But all three suffered far greater per capita excess deaths than Sweden. The Swedes allowed the virus to spread in care homes, so if that major failure had been fixed, their death rate could have been a lot lower still. If you're going to have less severe restrictions, like Sweden, then you need a cost-effective treatment regime, and that's where hydroxychloroquine comes in. And there are now 53 studies that show positive results of hydroxychloroquine in COVID infections. There are 14 global studies that show neutral or negative results, and 10 of them were of patients in very late stages of COVID-19 where no antiviral drug can be expected to have much effect. Of the remaining 4 studies, 2 come from the same University of Minnesota author, the other 2 are from the faulty Brazil paper, which should be retracted, and the fake Lancet paper, which was. A report from Real Clear Politics points out that millions of people are taking or have taken hydroxychloroquine in nations that have managed to get their national pandemic under some degree of control. 2 recent large early-use clinical trials have been conducted by the Henry Ford Health System and at Mount Sinai, showing a 51% and 47% lower mortality, respectively, in hospitalised patients given hydroxychloroquine. A recent study from Spain, published on July 29, shows a 66% reduction in COVID mortality in patients taking hydroxychloroquine. No serious side effects were reported in these studies and no epidemic of heartbeat abnormalities. And then there's the experience in Switzerland with hydroxychloroquine.
And then there's Switzerland and the use of the drug hydroxychloroquine, banned in Victoria and Queensland for treating the coronavirus. As I have repeatedly pointed out on this show, there are now dozens of international studies that show the drug used in the correct combination with other drugs and the correct dose, it is effective, including the latest study that shows countries that use hydroxychloroquine early on have a 79% lower COVID-19 mortality rate. But here's the clincher. Switzerland briefly banned the drug after The Lancet claimed it was killing people. That's the medical journal. That study, you'll remember we discussed it here, was completely debunked. And 2 weeks later, The Lancet withdrew the study and immediately Switzerland reinstated the drug. And guess what happened? During the 2 weeks, Switzerland stopped using hydroxychloroquine. Well, according to a study done by Johns Hopkins University, the consequences of suddenly stopping hydroxychloroquine can be seen by examining the case fatality ratio index for Switzerland. It can be seen that during the weeks preceding the ban on hydroxychloroquine, the index fluctuated between 3 and 5%. But after stopping outpatient hydroxychloroquine use, the country's COVID-19 deaths increased 4 times to the highest level it had been since the pandemic began, oscillating at over 10 to 15%. Then, when early outpatient hydroxychloroquine was reinstated on June the 11th, the 4-fold wave of excess lethality rapidly returned back to where it was. And there are plenty of other reports, such as the one on DocWire News that says our findings suggest that patients confirmed for COVID-19 infection should be administered HCQ as soon as possible. Or a study from China that says patients treated with HCQ at the time of early hospital recovered faster than those who were treated later, or another study that found that when the drug was given in the first 7 days, the benefits were greatly improved, or this graph that shows the case fatality rate of countries in blue that use or encourage the drug, and in red, the ones that don't. I don't need to spell it out for you. But here's the real joke. I have been denigrated this week by the medical community in Australia for merely reporting this news and discussing hydroxychloroquine use around the world, talking about the drug. Bizarrely, the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners magazine attacked me personally, as well as federal MP Craig Kelly. You'd think these lefties might actually be worrying about curing COVID patients and protecting the elderly rather than sneering at Sky News presenters and politicians. Still, we really should take our medical practitioners and their lobby groups seriously. I mean, they're the same mob who, as part of the COVID-19 recovery, are urging Scott Morrison to act quickly on climate change. You couldn't make this stuff up. So allow me to remind our political leaders and our media bureaucrats, medical bureaucrats, of 2 little words that deserve to haunt you in the wee hours of the morning: Sweden and Switzerland. Will history record that not only was the destruction of our economy completely pointless, but preventative treatments such as drugs like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine in combination with others were sitting there right under our noses all along?
Hydroxychloroquine is cheap. It costs about 70 cents a tablet, and it can be taken at home. It fits in with the National Pandemic Plan for respiratory viruses, and a course of therapy simply requires swallowing 3 tablets in the first 24 hours, followed by 1 tablet every 12 hours for 5 days. And as we've seen, it's also effective. If we implement a loose level 2 with masks in public spaces, a bit of social distancing, and easy access to hydroxychloroquine, then we could effectively manage living with the virus. Repeated lockdowns are unsustainable in the long run, but right now it is all the government has as a strategy. And that strategy was based on seriously flawed models, based on the models produced by the now disgraced COVID Chicken Little from the UK, Neil Ferguson. This is groundbreaking news about the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine. Why is it not being widely reported? Why is our media trying to run the New Zealand pandemic response with its own misinformation? What a sorry state our country is in. We've been systematically lied to, we were locked down illegally, our businesses are failing, and 89% of workers in Auckland are on the wage subsidy. Things are not as grand as we've been told. Just as well the election was delayed. Perhaps it should be delayed another month so even more truth can come out. So far it's been 2 solid weeks of bad news for the government. This week promises to have even more as media hit their strides now that the scales have fallen from their lying eyes. I can imagine that UMR is telling the Prime Minister that she is no longer infallible and they are sliding in the polls. The election is now game on. The more we know about the situation at the border, the less we believe the politicians in charge. This economy can't sustain another lockdown, and so the government is going to have to come up with another strategy. Surely we should be looking at how countries like Taiwan, Sweden and Switzerland have fared and start to move to similar strategies. What we do know is that every country that tried a lockdown has wrecked their economy. That's not sustainable. Perhaps it is time the adults were put in charge. I'm Cam Slater, and this was Insight Politics.